What's up? We're back! I don't really have a cool intro to this video. I'm still kind of embarrassed from how I closed the last one, so I figure I'll keep the shenanigans to a minimum this time. If you missed the first part, go watch that first, but for the rest of you, let's just get right on to the next game. I'm honestly upset this game is on this list, because how has it not been remade? It deserves an HD remaster if nothing else, but instead, I have to talk about it here because it's so good, and really the only thing that holds it back is how kind of bad the graphics are. Some stuff looks really good. It has the classic static backgrounds most other PS1 RPGs have, and some very nice cinematics.
Who is she? That is not your concern.
But the character models don't have much detail, even in combat, and the whole presentation of the game seems like a weird mix of ugly FF7 polygonal graphics with the higher quality 3D sprite art style of Final Fantasy 8 and 9, but everything else in the game feels much more modern, and with a fresh coat of paint and a remake or a remaster, I think a lot more people would understand why this game is so loved. The main draw is the unique battle system it has. Whereas a lot of RPGs get crap for their tap A to win random encounter grind, this game requires you to actually pay attention in every battle to get maximum damage, as you play a little rhythm game with each attack to combo moves and avoid counterattacks from some enemies. Even magic engages the player as you frantically tap to boost magic power, though I'll admit I don't like this one as much, but you don't do it nearly as often, so it never wore out as welcome for me, though it did wear out my button a little bit. These mechanics are technically optional, but the power output is drastically different enough that it's worth putting in the effort, and it also just sets this battle system apart in a cool way from other RPGs of the era. Aside from combat itself, there's some cool character upgrade gimmicks as you level up your party's combo attacks and unlock new, stronger ones as you go that require longer rhythm sequences to fully complete. It's really satisfying, honestly, when you complete the rhythm sequence to dodge enemy counterattacks and unleash a full power combo, and it feels like a turn-based version of a modern action RPG. Really, with a few tweaks, remaking this game would work just as well, if not better, than the way Square is modernizing the Final Fantasy VII remake. The story of this game is also really cool, though I'll admit that while I came close as a kid, I've never actually beaten this one either, but it deals with dragons, and that's good enough for me because dragons are friggin' rad. The other cool thing about the game relates to those dragons, as the characters get the ability, throughout the game, to transform into dragoons that can harness the power of different dragons to gain stronger attacks for a limited time. I wish this ability unlocked a little earlier, as the first few hours can be a little slow, and I'll admit, this is far from the best RPG ever made, but it's one of the few Sony first-party games that I feel has been forgotten to time, even though it did well enough for a sequel to be planned, even if it was eventually cancelled without much fanfare. But as a game trying to compete with the big dogs at Square and Enix, yeah, they were separate, remember? It's surprising to me that there hasn't been more desire to revisit this potential franchise during this era of Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo all reliving nostalgia. Maybe there's still hope though. No one expected a medieval remake after all. It's funny, growing up, I could have swore I knew this series better. For my PlayStation Classic, I grabbed the first and second games in the series to find out which one I played more because I couldn't remember, and it turns out both of those are kind of really bad, actually. So I went to the internet because I remembered a few details, such as an awesome bedroom level, and found out it was actually the fourth entry that I played. And I apparently never even touched those first few games. Playing them briefly made me kind of glad about that, because the press forward to drive mechanic was clunky, and the frame rate chugged to the point of almost being unplayable. So I was excited to jump into the fourth game, which I did remember fondly, and I mean, it's better. They fixed the horrible controls, and the game plays a lot more smoothly while also looking infinitely better, but it still really doesn't hold up. For starters, aiming literally anything is a chore. The turn radius on the vehicles is very loose, and the other enemies zip around you without a care, so outside of the weapons that vaguely home in, trying to hit anything is like shooting fish in an aquarium from the parking lot using an airsoft gun. Huh. That seems like a really American metaphor. I'm sorry to anyone that didn't click with. Anyway, while the driving controls are vastly improved, tying the aiming reticle to the front of your vehicle still makes the actual act of driving in this game not that fun, as you spend more time slowly reversing and pointing yourself toward the enemy than you do actually exploring the maps. Speaking of the maps though, they're just as great as I remember. From the starting junkyard level I'm pretty sure everyone can at least picture, to the aforementioned bedroom that makes the whole match feel like Hot Wheels on a murder spree in the best way, to the more windy highway that lets you get a drop on folks, and more, this is the epitome of Twisted Metal to me. Though I know most prefer Twisted Metal Black due to some of its quality of life improvements and better graphics. It's just a bummer this game isn't actually that fun to play, because I still really enjoyed exploring the levels, finding all the secret areas packed with superpowered weapons. But when it came time to play the game and do the thing, I was more content with letting the enemies kill each other, honestly. I still love this series, and I want it to come back with a modern twist. Metal. But man, it doesn't hold up to anything I'd rather play with friends these days. It's got a serious case of GoldenEye syndrome, where people still hold it on a multiplayer pedestal that it doesn't deserve anymore. It was great in its time, but that doesn't mean it still is, you know? There. GoldenEye makes for a pretty universal metaphor, right? Speaking of games held on a multiplayer pedestal, Tony Hawk will always have a special place in my heart. And you know what? It actually holds up pretty well. Sure, it's clunky sometimes, and the presentation is coated with a pretty thick level of jank, but there's a reason this series had to basically be burned to the ground by the end before it would finally die, and even then its shambling corpse has tried to do a few more no-effort kickflips in recent years.
Everyone's gonna like the game, it's fun, you know, it's something different.
I'd argue none of those games really beat the first two though, and I'm focusing on the original because I had to pick one, and it had the more memorable levels. And before you come at me with, I thought this video wasn't going to include any games that have been remade, I'll shove that back in your face to say that the alleged remake is actually a best-of game that compiles parts of the first two games with new mechanics and enough new jank to grind on for hours. So don't even come into my skate park and tell me that that pathetic excuse for a reboot is worth being in this discussion. It was the first zombified attempt at a reboot of this beloved series, and I won't have its presence sullying my video any longer. But if you want to talk OG Tony Hawk, let's go. First, a note. I always default to playing as Alyssa Steamer. I don't know if it's because Kid Me thought it was cool to be the girl skater, or if it's because she has a fairly well-balanced set of stats so she seemed like a safe pick, but for the sake of recording, I recreated that quirk to make this footage a little more unique. Alright, moving on. This game still rocks. The levels are still some of the best in the whole series as they're tight and well structured, but also stay true to the areas they're based on, such as the school adding some obvious ramps and stuff, but also having an outdoor lunch area with tables to grind on, and a gymnasium to discover complete with behind the bleacher makeout points. That are empty, of course. This game's rated T. There's also a few uniquely different levels, such as the mall that plays out more like a downhill slalom, where you have to rush your way through to not run out of time before you reach the end, as well as some traditional skate park challenges, which weren't my favorite, but kind of feel necessary when the rest of the game is full of arcadey gimmicks. There are certainly more iconic levels in later games, but many of them open up too much, especially later in the series like American Skateland, where it turned more open world so you get less diversity but more ability to free roam. I honestly grew to miss this arcade style though, and while I'm a big defender of the Tony Hawk Underground games, nothing will ever beat these first few classics. Everyone remembers Gauntlet, right? Classic arcade button-mashing action. Basically the first multiplayer horde combat game. At least as far as I know it was. is basically a ripoff of a game called Dandy. Well, that's disappointing. Well, anyway, Gauntlet was great, but it was a very shallow experience that was hard to evolve past the 8-bit era, you know? There were some sequels that mostly just reiterated the same stuff with a few new classes and features with a bit more dynamic levels, but mostly just more of the same. Along comes Gauntlet Legends, the first 3D title in the series that tried to evolve it for new hardware, much like Zelda and Mario. Except, like, that's a terrible comparison because man, this game is kinda rough. You have to understand, I loved Gauntlet in general as a kid, but this was a game I played a little later with my brother quite a bit, though, again, only as a rental, so I was excited to pick it back up. It's not bad, technically, it's just really clunky and awkward to play. They created a more modern experience here, where you explore set levels and elemental-themed worlds with more enemy variety and some cool ability modifiers to mix up the repetitive hack-and-slash combat, but it's still just Gauntlet. And more importantly, it's kinda ugly 3D Gauntlet that plays noticeably slower and with levels more spaced out and surprisingly empty for being a horde game. Also, remember those modifiers I mentioned? Super obtuse. Not only was I not always clear what I had just picked up, but they were also sometimes bad things. It feels like the kind of game that probably had a good manual to explain all this stuff, but jumping back into it in 2019 just doesn't click. And it definitely feels like a product of its time, but like, even kind of janky and budget for its time. The main problem I have is similar to Twisted Metal, where the attacks are tied to the movement, so it tends to be this clunky, shifting towards enemies while attacking thing to try and take out all the horde, and then wiggle toward the gate to stop more from moving. It works in 8-bit when everything is on a grid, but it just doesn't translate to 3D as well. And I think the fact that future 3D Gauntlet games fixed a lot of the aiming issues shows how clunky it was here. And while this game does have a close-range melee attack too, it's not any better because it'll make you take more damage than it's worth, even though you can guarantee to also hit. There's also some cool special AoE attacks, but like I said, these modifiers and other menu-based specials are confusing to even tell when you have them, so I didn't play around with them nearly as much as I probably should have. You could tell me to get good, sure, but I'm gonna blame how the game doesn't explain anything. So there. There's a lot of mainline Mega Man spin-offs, some of which even became long-running series of their own, with varying levels of quality, and I'm gonna touch on some of those Mega Man games in another video. But one of the most underrated of these is the Legends games. There's only two, if you don't count the misadventures of Tron, and while I'm still holding out hope that Mega Man Legends 3 will be revived and get finished for the Switch, right now all we've got are these two hidden gems and their drastically different gameplay from any other Mega Man game. And like other series shifting from 2D to 3D, the shift actually works pretty well. It's not perfect, as the shooting mechanics mostly boil down to locking on and strafing without much else. Plus, I hate tank controls, so you wouldn't think I'd enjoy this game at all, but it still plays surprisingly smooth anyway, and the simple run and jump mechanics Mega Man is known for are still here, just in a new form. There's also a great satisfaction in exploring the various ruins in the game, which replace the Robot Master levels of past games, and searching for parts to create new equipment and weapons. This is the biggest difference, where Mega Man has to make his own weapons instead of just getting them from beating Robot Masters, but there's still some cool variety of moves to be gained from these weapons and body parts, such as faster dashing around the field, homing missiles, and an awesome blade arm that can be upgraded to send out a longer distance crescent beam slash. In general, there's a nice variety of weapon and armor customization in this game, which is part of why I love the second game over the first, even though I played Legends 1 more as a kid. Sure, it's a little weird to have to craft everything, as it makes the actual boss fights a little lackluster when, at most, all you get for beating them is some money and treasure. Aside from completing the plot objective, obviously. But it also gives this game its own identity, as it doesn't feel so tied to that same gameplay loop of other Mega Man series, and it makes your power level more focused on how well you explore, which is fitting given the entire concept of this game is that Mega Man and his friends are diggers, searching for ancient treasures. To just be handed powerful weapons by boss creatures would feel at odds with the gameplay just so it could feel more like a Mega Man game. I don't want to dig too much into the story of this game, because it's kind of goofy and I don't really get it. But I love the graphical style, and while the voice acting is pretty awful, it's presented in a very cinematic, visually pleasing way that still really holds up. I honestly think a slightly cleaned up HD remaster of these two games could do really well and help fuel the fires for supporting Legends 3. But if that never happens, they're still some of the best looking PS1 games ever made, in my opinion, due to a stylized and simplistic art style similar to how Wind Waker still looks good to this day, even after a much better looking remake for that game has been released. I just want to see these games get a similar re-release, so more people can appreciate them for the unique elements they brought to the Mega Man license. I remember this game being akin to GoldenEye on N64, but without the multiplayer and a bigger focus on gadgets. And at a glance, that's what it is. But the controller mapping is terrible and makes pretty much anything in the game an exercise in frustration while being shot to death. A major part of that problem comes from the lack of analog control. It's weird, because when I looked it up, I found out this game came out after the DualShock controller was introduced for PS1, but the game still has no DualShock support. Because of that, aiming feels incredibly outdated, and doing basically anything in this game, from switching weapons to using gadgets, takes more button combinations than it realistically should, and moving while shooting is nearly impossible to manage. There's an impressive level of production value throughout the game, from fully rendered cutscenes to motion captured animations and voice acting, but while the game environments look nicely rendered and have a lot of subtle detail, it doesn't make up for how clunky the game is to play, so it's hard to look past the faults and appreciate the attention to detail. I haven't really touched on the actual level variety of objectives because, they're basically the same as the movie this is based on, as well as the better N64 version of this game, but I also just couldn't be bothered to play this long enough to get more footage to show the variety. I had more fun with it as a kid because I didn't know shooters could be better. I already mentioned that even GoldenEye doesn't really hold up, and that game is way better than this one. But now, I was pretty close to not even including it in this video, because I struggled to play very long, but hey, you gotta take the good with the bad, right? James Bond games are supposed to make you feel like a cool, sexy secret agent, but this game makes him play more like Paul Blart Mall Cop. I don't even know where to begin with this game. It's not only one of the best RPGs ever made, but it's one of my favorite games of all time. It's another one I'm legitimately upset has never been remastered, but considering Chrono Trigger is infinitely more popular than this one, and it's only gotten a few basic ports with no major improvements, we'll probably never see a better version of this game released, sadly. I don't want to spend too long going deep into what makes the game great. It could easily be its own video, but one of my favorite things in it is the dimension travel mechanics and the way that plays into the story, so I'll focus on that. Time travel was a major draw in Chrono Trigger, but I felt like they went too cartoonish with it. There were some interesting elements, but a lot of the game was spent in prehistoric times or in the far-flung future, so most of the changes felt fairly disconnected from the characters themselves. Whereas one of the first things that happens in Chrono Cross is for your main character Serge? I don't know, for your main character to get flung into an alternate present where no one believes he is who he says he is. Because in this alternate timeline, he was killed as a child, and it's clearly a sore subject in his town. Seeing the reactions from people the player just met is heartbreaking. But there is one issue. Since he's a silent protagonist, I feel like we never get to understand the full emotion behind this shift, and that's a bummer. But I still think it's a much stronger first experience with time travel than the trip 400 years into the past that Chrono Trigger utilizes to set the tone. To be clear, Chrono Cross doesn't technically involve time travel, but it gets pretty complicated with the dimension hopping, and there are certainly elements of time manipulation at play, so it's just easier to say it's time travel so it aligns better with people familiar with Chrono Trigger. The reason I like this more, though, is because of the way it affects the characters, as I mentioned. Sure, Chrono Trigger has the interesting wrinkle of Marley? These names. being the descendant of a princess and trying to alter events in the past to prevent a world-ending calamity that they discover after going to a post-apocalyptic future. All cool stuff. But this one directly ties the different universes to the main character in a way I don't want to delve into deeper for fear of spoilers, but suffice it to say everything in the game happens because of how the characters interact with the different timelines, and the changes more directly affect each dimension in really cool ways. I could see the story of this game turning off casual fans, as it definitely goes some crazy places, and there's a lot to keep track of. But I'd argue the gameplay is solid enough to keep the player engaged, even if they're not interested in the madness. The big draw is the element system. Basically, every character has a main element tied to them, and they get special abilities and attacks that use those elements. If you can change the color of the whole gauge in the corner, that element's power will be enhanced until the color changes. This is all high-level explanation, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the underlying concept here is really neat and unique, as most attacks are single-use instead of MP-based. As the characters level up, they'll gain more spell slots, which you can think of similar to D&D, where you have so many spells you can use at that level. And how do you gain power to use those stronger spells? A really cool combo-based melee attack system. Each successful attack fills the magic bar by the power level number of that attack, but the higher the number, the lower the accuracy and more damage if it hits. If you build up to higher powers through a combo string though, it'll increase the likelihood of those attacks hitting. But you also can't keep attacking forever as there's limited stamina, and if you push it too far you might not have any power to attack the next round, which gives the enemy another chance to get more damage on you. Generally, you can finish most basic enemies in one round by spamming the most powerful combo and then ending your turn with a powerful magic attack, but with bosses you get to make use of some strategy, or can easily get overwhelmed if you don't understand the system. It's also worth noting that healing magic is part of this spell system too, so you have to prepare ahead for healing your party as it's all limited use, creating a risk-reward system when battles go south. As you can see, there's a lot to cover with this game, and I didn't even cover all of it, which is why it could easily be its own video. But the amount I have to say about it is just proof of how great it is and how much I love it. I need to move on, but the one thing I don't like is that almost all the weapons and armor you get in the game have to be crafted from materials you get in chests and from enemies. I've never liked that kind of system in RPGs, but it's not a deal breaker. I just wish you could buy some and only have to craft more powerful ones like in Final Fantasy IX. But hey, nothing's perfect, right? Whew. I just spent a little bit too long on that last game. Sorry. But that's it. 7 more games I loved as a kid. Some are still amazing. Others are probably better lost time, honestly. But please, feel free to share your favorite childhood PS1 games with me. Let's all reminisce together. Unless I didn't play your favorite games, then you can reminisce and I can learn a thing or two. It'll still be a good time. Regardless, just talk to me in the comments, please. I'm so lonely. Beautiful sounds I make. Should do an ASMR channel. GoldenEye makes for a pretty Feel free to share your childhood. Anyway, friends of Electro is my second favorite. But for the sake of recording, I recreated. You get for talking through a burp. There's a lot of mainland Mega Man. Mainland? Why do I keep saying mainland? That's not a word. There's a lot of mainline Mario? I got past mainline. I'm gonna get this. Mainline, Mega Man, mainline, Mega Man, mainline, Mega Man.